Esther, the second chapter. If you would open your Bible to that little book of Esther, chapter number 2, and we're going to see Esther made the queen. We're on session 3 now, and in session 3 we have, in session 1 we looked at a little bit of background of when we are in the date, and there really are 3 dates given, as you may remember. One of them is about 521 BC. That's the earliest date. The other one that I more lean to is about 483 BC, and the third one is a little later, and that's 442 BC. We won't go through all of that kind of stuff, but I put this as post-exile, and Ezra, Nehemiah, at least Ezra, and the first wave of returnees, if you will, have already gone back, and yet some people chose to stay. And those people who chose to stay, my presumption is they could have gone but decided not to go, and that tells us a little bit about their faith. Now, if they were sitting here, 2 things. If they were sitting here, one, they might have a different story. They might say, you totally misunderstand that, and shame on you, because it's not even told in the scripture, and yet you made all that stuff up. And then they might be right, because I don't know exactly why Esther didn't go back, Mordecai, all those people that stayed, why didn't they go back? Or maybe they would say, you're right, we could have gone back, and we didn't go back. At least at some point they could have gone back, no doubt about it, because there were times, especially when you get to Nehemiah, where the king says, hey, you want to go? Go. Here's your letter. Take it with you. You got protection along the way. You've got safety. Basically, he says it's good for the kingdom, for the Persian kingdom, for the Jewish people to go back and build their city. And the Persians were very accommodating, if you will, to the other ethnicities and their cultures. So certainly somewhere they had a right and an opportunity to go back. So maybe they would say, you're right, we didn't go back, but it's not because we rejected God, it is because fill in the blank. Now, that's the kind of thing I would want to dig into a little deeper. I might feel a little uncomfortable investigating Mordecai over this, just because of the situation and who he is. But I would want to make sure with Mordecai, who probably would be the decision maker there, Mordecai, you tell me it's not a rejection of God, but you know, this other thing, is that really the issue, or is that just sort of the excuse? How many of you have ever had an excuse? Never. So, it's easy to justify ourselves, right? And so I would think probably Esther, Mordecai, and these others might justify themselves by saying, well, I had this and that and circumstances, and maybe Mordecai would see as we get into chapter 2, maybe he could say, well, you know what, there was this little girl Esther, and her mom and dad were sick, and then they died, and I just, and on and on, I never could get there. And maybe that's all very accurate. But my assumption, I give all that to be very fair to Esther and Mordecai and everything, my assumption is they could have gone back and they didn't go back. And whether it was their choice individually or more just a collective choice, because, again, probably all of us kind of go along with the group a little bit, don't we? And so somebody, the group had decided, no, this is best, and we're going to do blah, 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 blah. And so the story goes, and so we just end up there. And so somehow they didn't get back. Well, not getting back then, regardless of what's on the surface of it, not being in the land when you can be the land and you're a Jew, I think, says something about what you think about God's promise to Abraham. And the fact that he's going to give that particular land, not Persia, but the land of Israel there, and he's going to make a nation out of that, not the Persian nation, but the Hebrew nation. And so you're at least saying, well, I don't think God's going to do that today. It's not such a big issue today, and put that off. Remember that old song that almost has nothing to do with this, but that old song that says, "Seems now some soul to say, go Spirit, go thy way. On thee some more convenient day I'll call." Y'all remember that song, don't you? That's another one I mentioned Sunday that I've never heard the tune, and then someone who listened online actually sent me the tune of the one I mentioned Sunday, so that's just a hint that I don't know how that other song goes, but we do kind of say, on thee some more convenient day, I'll call. It's built upon that passage in Acts when King, is it Agrippa or one of those, says to Paul, almost you persuaded me, but not today, go, I'll hear you again another day. Well, maybe Mordecai and Esther and all this group of Jews that are in Persia are saying, someday we'll get there, but right now we have to do such and such and carry out our business. So, in chapter 1, then, we have what I am going to take, and maybe there's more, and I'm going to be keeping this cognizant in my mind to try to search for it. Maybe there's more in chapter 1 that is implicit prophecy, so to speak, but I'm taking chapter 1 to serve as a historical background that you can't have chapter 2 if you don't have chapter 1, and you just need the information there. So I don't know that we have so much prophecy embedded in chapter 1 as we're going to, starting in chapter 2 and even more so as we go further. But it's the historical background, and having the historical background, as in, for example, chapter 2 begins saying, after these things. Somehow we got to know what those things were, right? And so chapter 1 is there to tell us these things. All through chapter 1 and chapter 2, as I've mentioned before, but I want to mention it again, there is there really is a lack of morality in there. Chapters 1 and chapter 2 especially are things that old-time Baptist preachers love to preach on, because there's so much sin in there that we can condemn. And we can get them for drunkenness, we can get them for, I remember once years and years ago, I preached a sermon from Esther chapter 2 on how to choose a wife, and basically I said, not this way, and then I made stuff up about how you ought to choose a wife, and this was before I preached the Bible verse by verse, but all the Baptists in the crowd thought it was a wonderful sermon because it was pop psychology, and there's blood, there's intrigue, there's conspiracy, there's women's lib, there, you name it, you can pull it out of there. But I would say chapters 1, 2, really all through the book, it is almost what the term I think I don't want to use is amoral. Not immoral, but amoral. That is, there's just no commentary on the morality of any of it. It really is, as they say, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Whether what the king's doing is right or what the queen's doing is wrong or the queen's doing is right or whatever, it doesn't give us any hint of that. So I think that since the book neither condones nor condemns what's happening in this activity, it's better just to present it as matter of fact. Here's what happened. So I think then, if we get caught up studying the book of Esther, and we get caught up talking about how what is about to happen is no way to have a courtship, then we would be talking about something the book is not really talking about. And we would divert ourselves, and we certainly don't want to divert ourselves. So we see here the search for a queen in verses 1 through 4. It says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Does anybody remember what they did with Vashti, by the way? We don't know. Thank you. That's what I wanted you to say. All we know is she wasn't queen anymore. As far as we know, she might have been eating bonbons in the south of France. We don't know. She might have been executed, as we kind of presume, but we don't know. So he, sometime later, remembers what was decreed against her, and so, verse 2, then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins into Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hege, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women. And let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this thing pleased the king, and he did so. Clearly, he didn't have to work too hard to convince the king on this one. He says, hey, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's begin to to do this, and so they go out and they begin to carry out this activity, and they put someone in charge of it. The king's chamberlain go out and get all these women, bring them in. There is really not any telling how many there are, other than we have 127 provinces, and he's to appoint officers in all the provinces that they may gather together all the young virgins. It looks like more than one young virgin per province, so we probably got a lot of ladies in this beauty contest that are coming together. One of the Jewish rabbis, whether he's right or wrong, says 1,400 women. He probably made that number up, but nonetheless, he says 1,400 women. It's a lot of, even if you go with 127, that's a lot of women to choose from, isn't it? And they're to bring in, he says, in verse 3, they're things for purification. Don't see that in a religious sense. That basically means, as we're going to see in a little bit, that means cosmetics, oils, the things that would make her look beautiful. And this is what she is going to carry out. Well, we introduce ourselves to the one who will be the queen then through all this process. It says in verse 5, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Here comes Mordecai, first of all. The scripture tells us he's a Jew, and then it tells us his ancestry here. We don't know, honestly, who Jair, Shimei, and Kish are. All that we know is he's a Benjamite. There are some who believe that this Kish is the same who is the father of Saul, King Saul, but the timing here just doesn't work out for it to be that same one. So we got a guy named Mordecai. Now, Josephus says about Mordecai that he is Esther's uncle, and Josephus then says one of the principal persons among the Jews. So he's got some sort of distinguished position. I want to take Josephus' thought here. He's one of the distinguished persons among the Jews, the principal persons among the Jews, and say, I think he's right based upon some of the things that we're going to see even in this chapter, that Mordecai is a well-known Jew because of his position. Now, his name is Mordecai. That is a Babylonian name. That is not a Jewish name. Although in Judaism today, a lot of Jewish people might name their son, Mordecai. But in that day, nobody would have named their child Mordecai. And the Jewish people only do it today, of course, because of this man, and he's famous. We don't know what his Hebrew name is, but we can almost be certain he had a Hebrew name. We're going to get to Esther in a moment, and she had a Hebrew name, which was Hadassah, that's right. So Mordecai's Hebrew name is not mentioned, but very likely he had a Hebrew name. Now, that was not uncommon that the Jewish people would take on a local name and have their Jewish name. You know some other people like that, right? Such as, in the Bible, Paul and Saul. Paul is a Greek name. Shaul, Saul, is a very much a Hebrew name. I'm sorry? How about those three famous ones? Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And their buddy Daniel. All four of them had both Hebrew names and their Jewish names. Daniel, interestingly, we always call him by his Danny. We always call him Danny, yes. And that would be his Jewish name. But his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we always call them by their Babylonian names. Now, I have a little bit of a theory here. Again, I'm on a little bit of thin ice, but you know I don't mind getting on thin ice sometimes. So here's let me weave out my theory. Mordecai is a name that we believe comes from the Babylonian god Marduk. Now, Marduk, we think of him as a cartoon, a big dog, right? But he was a Babylonian god, Marduk. And Mordecai is morphed out of that. If that's the case, then that would not really be a good name to go by, would it, if you're a Jew? Because the first commandment for the Jews is, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and the second is, thou shalt not have any graven images. Well, if you name yourself Marduk and go by Marduk, it seems to go against commandment number 1 and commandment number 2, right? And so if you don't mind carrying that name, so much so that we don't even know what the other guy's name is, you're a principal person among the Jews and we don't even know what your Jewish name is, it tells me, again, there's a, what do they call it, a confirmation bias here, so I want you to question the assumptions well, but my bias is that these are people who have kind of left their Judaism behind other than culturally. They're cultural Jews. It's just that a Jewish person back that day, Mordecai would just point to Marduk and they would say, no, not so much. Now, you say, well, what about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They didn't mind taking their names. And I would say, well, what about Daniel? Daniel seemed to mind taking his Babylonian name, which was actually Belshazzar. And Belshazzar means Baal shall protect. But, again, I'm reading a little into this. It seems like Daniel is saying, my name is Daniel. God is my judge. And I am not going to carry around the name Baal shall protect when God is my judge. So, yeah, that's what they call me, but you call me Daniel. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, on the other hand, they have Hebrew names. We know their Hebrew names, of course. Everyone who graduated from first grade Sunday school knows that their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then when you went off to camp, you know, at the end of the day, it said on the schedule, Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go. But their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Every one of those, by the way, points to God. Any Hebrew name that ends with Ayah, like Jeremiah, has to do with Yahweh, and ends with El, has to do with Elohim. So Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were the names. But they seem to say, I don't care if you call me Shadrach or Meshach or Abednego, but those names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are not names that are offensive to the commandments. Shadrach means great scribe. Yeah, okay, call me great scribe. Meshach means, I'm going to have to look at my notes here. Meshach means guest of the king. That's fine. And Abednego is servant of the prophet. Now, that's the one that comes closest because we don't know which prophet we're talking about that he's the servant of. But it could have been very much that say, hey, Daniel's the prophet and you're a servant of the prophet, Abednego. In that sense. So I think because, again, this is my theory, because Daniel says, I'm not taking that. The other three say, call me that. But here's Mordecai, that Mordecai should have been like a Daniel, right? Mordecai should have said, don't call me after that pagan god. Call me by my given name, my Jewish name. So here's Mordecai, who's a principal figure among the Jews, according to Josephus. And Mordecai, I think certainly, he knows he's a Jew, but he's even going to encourage Esther in a few minutes to hide her Judaism, keep that secret. So, that's a lot different than, being willing to die for your faith and the martyrdom that we think of among Jews and early Christians. He doesn't seem to be there. Seems to be a little more, save your neck kind of thing, go along to get along and everything's fine. I think that's the kind of people that God is dealing with here, and this is why we don't see God on the surface in the book of Esther. We see him behind the surface, under the scenes, as they say in the title, out of the land, but under God's hand. Now we pick up in verse 6. Says, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. A couple of things that we need to note about this. First of all, if the who in verse 6 is Mordecai, then we have a dating problem for the later date for 86, for 83. that I've given you. And the problem is that Mordecai would be well over 100 years old by this time. And he does not appear to be well over 100 years old. So the captivity in which Jeconiah, king of Judah, had been carried away, that was in 5, did I write it on the outline? 597 BC. So the exiles went into captivity. The first group, which included Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they went in 609 BC. First group of deportees. The second group went in 597, and that included somebody in this verse, and it included Ezekiel the prophet, for example, and Jeconiah the king. And in fact, Jeconiah was cursed with this in an interesting way in which God said, no descendant of Jeconiah will ever sit on the throne. And the interesting thing about that is that when you come to the book of Matthew and there's the genealogy of Jesus, guess who's in there? Jeconiah. And so how do you say, wait a minute, Jesus is a descendant of Jeconiah, and no descendant of Jeconiah will sit on the throne? I actually take Matthew genealogy almost the flip side of everybody else. Everybody else says Matthew put that genealogy to prove that Jesus was rightful heir to the throne. And I say Matthew put that genealogy in there to prove that Jesus was not related to them. Because he comes to the end of all that, and he says then, but he wasn't born of Joseph. This is Joseph's line. Don't think Jesus is a son of Joseph, because if he was a son of Joseph, he couldn't inherit that throne. So he kind of twists it there right at the beginning. In fact, I think that's why they say of Jesus, isn't he the carpenter's son? And isn't the carpenter Joseph? And isn't Joseph related to Jeconiah? And how in the world is he going to sit on the throne there? And so the scripture gives it. So here's Jeconiah carried away in 597. Now, so here we have, is it talking about Mordecai was carried away? Actually, in Hebrew, it works grammatically. It can be Mordecai is carried away, or Kish, his, what would it be? Father, grandfather, Kish's great-grandfather was carried away. Now, that would fit in the timing of the average length of time we have people living in this day. So probably it's more the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who was carried away. So it's Kish, great-grandpa, that was carried away with the captivity in which had been Jeconiah had been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, verse 7, he, Mordecai, brought up Hadassah. There's that name. Now, actually, Hadassah means myrtle. Know anyone named Myrtle? Probably not, but you've heard the lady's name Myrtle, right? It's not very popular today. In Israel, you would hear the name Esther, Hadassah, or Myrtle. Any of those three would be familiar names. In fact, the very famous hospital in Israel is called the Hadassah Hospital after this. Myrtle is symbolically, some people would even say it's symbolic of Israel. I said it's symbolic of bounty and blessing. So here's her name. It's at least mentioned there, but she goes by the name Esther, not Hadassah. And Esther, again, there's a little bit of a wiggle room here that maybe I'm wrong on this, but etymology, the study of where words come from, we think Esther comes from that Babylonian goddess Ishtar. This doesn't look good, does it? We have the Jewish heroes of Marduk and Ishtar. Again, if you were God and you had a deep-seated love that you were going to save these people, but you also had a jealousy for your own reputation, which God does, wouldn't you work at an arm's length kind of behind the scenes? I think I would. So this is what God does here, is he says, these are Jews that don't mind taking the name of other gods. I'm not just going to come down and associate myself with them, but I'm rather going to hide here behind the curtain, and I'm going to work the things out as need be. But in the end, if you, now you all are more religious than this and spiritual than this, but if you weren't religious and spiritual, you'd be saying, there's no miracle in the book of Esther. You say, Esther put her neck out there, but a lot of people do that, right? In fact, you might say, she was pretty immoral to get to the place where she was. That's not really a miracle. Everything in the book of Esther can be explained without any kind of work of the Spirit, can't it? Just so. Now we look at it and say, yeah, but God's working here behind the scenes, and He's working to bring it about. So here's Ishtar, and I might just say this is where some believe, I'm not sure I'm convinced on this, some believe we get even the name of our resurrection celebration, Easter, from, and of course the line goes out there anyway that we shouldn't say Easter because it comes from Ishtar. And I'm not even sure I'm convinced of the whole thing, but I've never heard anyone say, and for heaven's sake, don't name your daughter Esther either. We're somewhat inconsistent in our scruples. So, verse 7. He brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her the things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to give her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maidens unto the best place of the house of the women. Now, we honestly don't know. She certainly has some preference here. We don't know how much preference she's getting. She gets 7 maids. Do others get 7 maids? I don't know if the others get 7 maidens also, but she does, and every appearance is the keeper of the women, the keeper of the harem here, is promoting her in her role. And we come then to verse 10. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Again, this secrecy is very different from Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You remember in chapter 1 when Daniel and friends were also put through a little bit of a beauty contest, weren't they? And what did Daniel and his friends decide to do? We're not going to eat of the king's food. That's right. And they were very clear why we're not going to eat of the king's food, because it's not kosher. It would violate our religious principles. We're not going to do it. So they didn't mind at all, not only saying we're Jewish. Now, obviously, they had just been deported from Babylon, so it's kind of hard to hide that part of it. But they could have just said, go along to get along, bring us a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, and we'll have at it. But they didn't. They held to their principles, even at the risk of death, when you come to, of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's most famous story, when they say, we're not going to even bow down to the king of Nebuchadnezzar, or to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, because commandment number 1 and commandment number 2, and we're not going to break it. So this is a very different kind of story now, 100 some odd years later, when Esther just sort of keeps it quiet and goes against almost every Jewish principle there is here, and just rides along with it. Verse 11, when Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. This is one of the reasons in verse 11 why I think that Mordecai very likely had some kind of a position with King Ahasuerus, that he was well known in the kingdom, that he had some access that other people might not have had. Again, I may be reading this wrong, but I don't think Mordecai was this poor guy that is just sort of a beggar walking down by the street keeping his ear open, but rather he has a powerful position in the kingdom, as Daniel had many years earlier. So he's able to go check on her every day under whatever circumstances that is. Verse 12. Now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of women, for so were the days of purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Let me just say, if you work on getting beautiful for 1 year and you can't, then you don't belong in this group here, right? Okay, so this group had been given everything there was to look beautiful. Now, can I say something that's, I don't know if it's politically correct or not, but have you ever been to a city? Well, I used to live in Katy, Texas, of course, and Katy has a lot of big, rich houses, mile after mile after mile after mile of these neighborhoods of rich houses. And often, even just say, oh, we're from Katy, they would say, oh, that's where the rich and famous, or that might even say, you've heard this before, that's where the pretty people live. That's where the pretty people live. That's a pretty people neighborhood over there. And indeed, I might say there's a little bit to it, isn't there? Have you noticed that people in rich neighborhoods are prettier than people in poor neighborhoods? What is that? I am convinced that is not an issue of if you're pretty, you're going to become rich. I am convinced it's an issue of if you're rich, you can make yourself pretty. And rich people have more time to spend in front of the mirror, and they have the better hair straightener. That's what happened to me. I used a very bad one. They have the better hair straightener and the better cosmetologist and then all that kind of stuff, and they can afford the oil of Olay or whatever it is that's used today. I don't know. And put cucumbers on their eyes and, I don't know, lay under lights or something. So basically, it's my theory that anybody can be pretty. There's a few I've questioned my theory on, but most anybody can be pretty. If you just, work on it and develop it, you can get there, and anybody can get there. Now, here's these ladies that had every opportunity in the world was given to them. In fact, their career really was to be beautiful. And don't ever feel down on yourself if you look at someone on a magazine and you say, why don't I look like that? The reason you don't look like that is because it's not your career to look like that. They work 40 hours a week to work like that and have a whole staff of people that try to make them to look like these pretty people out there. It ain't natural. Okay, so just be okay with natural here. Now, how in the world do we get into these things? You all are beautiful, by the way. I just wanted to say. Yes. Now, moving on. Here, they had spent a year to beautify themselves, and so here it comes. Now, verse 13, it again gives us some description of what's going on here. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given to her to go with her out of the house of the women into the king's house. So she says, hey, I think I could best please the king with this, that, or the other, and she goes with it. Now, verse 14, in the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned unto the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. I don't think we'll talk about that verse anymore, right? Again, this is a book that doesn't express any kind of moral outrage or moral commendation. It's just the facts. This is what's happening here. So, moving on in verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther. Isn't that just gross? Yeah, what's the term they've been using of Donald Trump lately? That reprobate. And what do you call someone who abuses women? A pervert, okay. A predator, that's the word they've been using, a predator. I mean, this is predatory, basically, to gather all the women in and carry this out, and no doubt about it, and yet that's what it is. So when it came the turn of Esther, I mean, just even to read it is almost disgusting. It came the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come into the king. She required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Basically, Haggai knows the king, and he says, look, here's what you ought to do, here's what you ought to take, and so she does. Verse 16. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus and unto his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now, Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus. Both in English, really, and the Hebrew here, doesn't have any kind of a regard for how she was taken. And was she taken voluntarily? It's your turn, follow me. Or was she taken forcibly? Fact is, it just says she was taken, and there's no appearance that she was taken forcibly. The only reason I mention this is because the Septuagint does add a few words in here. That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Septuagint adds a few words to say she was taken under force. My hunch is, and again, it's nothing more than a hunch, but my hunch is the translators of the Septuagint felt such discomfort with this whole scene that they added in there just a little bit. She was taken forcibly, trying to clean up this thing just a little bit. So, was she a victim or not in this case? All I know is she was taken in, and I'm going to take it as she was ushered in, and she's going right along with this. And verse 17, the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. That, again, to me, doesn't sound like someone who's forced into this, because it looks like there's a connection, a companionship that happens here that we see all the way through the book. Verse 18, then the king made a great feast unto all the princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Here, this is a little bit different from the other banquet. Remember Vashti, we dreamt a little bit that maybe Vashti was upset because she didn't get to go to the great banquet, but she got to go to the peasants' banquet. And here he brings together the nobles, if you will, the princes and the servants, and has this banquet. A lot of parallels between chapter 1 that I put on the outline there. We won't go into them. Verse 19, it says, and when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat at the king's gate. Now, sitting at the king's gate isn't quite the same as you've got a peasant out there at the gate like Lazarus and the rich man, and he's out there at the gate wishing he could come in. The king's gate, all the way through, very consistently through the Old Testament, the king's gate is basically where the nobles would gather. And they would be there. It's kind of like in Washington, D.C., at the White House, of course, the Oval Office is right there. To have an office in the East Wing is, you fight over that kind of thing. The closer you are to the president, the more powerful your position, the more he cares for you. Well, to be there at the king's gate, I think, says, this is not a beggar Mordecai out there. This is someone with some power and position within the kingdom. And he is there at the king's gate. Verse 20, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. Now, if Mordecai has a position in the kingdom, and he raised Esther, don't you think everybody knew they're associated with each other? And if everybody knows they're associated with each other, and Mordecai is a good observant Jew, don't you think they know she's a Jew? Yeah, this Again, I got a lot of assumptions I'm building up on here that if any of them fall apart, then I got dominoes. But it appears to me that Mordecai and Esther really had lived their entire lives kind of secret. Yeah, we're Jews, but on Sabbath we pull the shades before we light the candle and not let this be known. Let's finish out the chapter. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, as you know, if you know the story, that's not an incidental piece. That's a very necessary piece to the story that is going to come up later, as Mordecai now saves the life of the king, really, and that king is going to end up honoring Mordecai before it's all said and done. But at this point, all that happens is it's written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, we're going to stop right there, even though I put some notes for chapter 3, verse 1. But next time we come together, we're going to meet Haman, Haman the Horrible, that we'll be introduced to next Wednesday night and get into chapter 3. With that, let me lead us in a word of prayer.